In the early part of the 20th century, Pittsburgh's Hill District was one of the most well-respected and world-renowned black neighborhoods in America. A dense community of arts, culture, business, and education, the Hill was one of the most culturally famous and socially influential minority districts outside of New York City's Harlem. Because of the community's strong ability to attract people from all over the world, the Hill was visited by countless tourists, celebrities, and politicians every single year. And in a neighborhood that was already made up of dense tenement homes, the Hill District never seemed to sleep. It was constantly crowded, bustling, and alive. But with an increasing density in the neighborhood, and all of the housing stock in the area getting old, outdated, and dilapidated, the community ran into significant problems. Rates of typhoid, tuberculosis, and infant mortality were orders of magnitude higher in the Hill District than they were in whiter, more suburbanized communities. And speaking of suburbanization, a new 20th century invention had already completely reshaped the landscape of public health, largely for the worse.
We're at the scene of a pretty bad smash-up here on U.S. Highway number 1 near Laurel, Maryland. The 3 people in that car were seriously hurt.
Automobiles were quickly becoming one of the most common causes of death for all Americans, regardless of class or race. Countless more folks were finding themselves paralyzed, disabled, or irreconcilably disfigured from surviving high-speed wrecks on new highways. And more still were dying of preventable illness or treatable injury simply because new automobile traffic meant that they couldn't get to a hospital on time. While this issue of a lack of proper field medical care and adequate hospital transport were pervasive in all sections of American society, it really etched itself into our public discourse, especially here in Pittsburgh, when former mayor and Pennsylvania Governor David L. Lawrence died needlessly of a heart attack during a campaign rally. And Lawrence was a well-liked, successful, politically active white guy who died of a heart attack just a stone's throw away from a hospital, surrounded by countless members of his own staff. It was quickly becoming clear that our system of medicine, especially out in the field away from doctors, nurses, and hospitals, was wholly inadequate, if not outright incompetent at saving lives. If you fell ill or got injured, especially in a car crash, cardiac episode, or drug overdose, seconds matter. You want someone to help you as soon as possible, and you want that person to know what they're doing. But prior to the 1960s, you only really had 2 options when it came to emergency medical care and transport. The first was to call the police, and this system had its problems right from the get-go. The availability of a police wagon depended entirely on whether or not the police were tied up with other calls. Furthermore, outside of maybe some bandages or some gauze, the police didn't really have any equipment or procedures. They had no training in emergency medical care or in anatomy or pharmacology. Effectively, calling the police to help you when you're bleeding out was the same, if not worse, than calling a school nurse to bring some saltines when you're there bleeding out. And crucially, immigrants and Black Americans did not trust the police. In a time before dash cameras and body cameras, police brutality and misconduct was a pervasive threat, and it also discouraged Black Americans from seeking help from authorities that they should be able to trust. But putting any cultural attitudes of police aside, response times for an emergency medical situation were significantly longer in a Black neighborhood than they were in a white neighborhood. So if you didn't want to sit around and wait for a cop, your second option was to call a local funeral home who would dispatch a hearse to your location, which would then escort you to the hospital. But just like the police, the morticians didn't have any training in how to deal with people who hadn't bled out yet. And in situations of life and death, their slow response times and inadequate training typically meant death. But at the very least, they were already there with a hearse, and I guess they'd be the first funeral home to give you a business card. But getting back on track, whether you were waiting for a cop or a hearse to save your life, you were shit out of luck. Enter Dr. Safar, the surgeon who had tried to save Governor Lawrence's life after his fatal heart attack. Being a very community-minded man, Dr. Safar noticed 2 very important but very solvable problems in his community. The first, obviously, was a lack of proper field medical care and transport. The second was a sharp increase in poverty and unemployment in the once bustling Hill District, caused primarily by the redevelopment of the entire neighborhood, which we'll definitely get into in a much longer and more in-depth video, so be sure to stick around and subscribe if you want to check that out. But seeing these problems facing his community, Dr. Safar had an idea to try to mitigate both of these disasters at once. With funding from local donors, the Federal War on Poverty, and the civil rights organization known as the Freedom House, Dr. Safar started by recruiting 25 chronically unemployed men in the Hill District, many of whom had criminal records, several of whom were high school dropouts, and a number of whom were veterans suffering from what we now understand to be PTSD. After rounding up these men that city papers had deemed utterly, quote, unemployable, Dr. Safar ran all 25 through a 30-week paramedical training course, the absolute first of its kind. The program covered everything from drugs and pharmacology to CPR and defensive high-speed driving. The trainees were taught state-of-the-art techniques to save people from choking, cardiac arrest, major bleeding, and other serious life-threatening injuries. Despite the apparent setbacks that faced many of the paramedic recruits, all 25 would graduate their training, and all 25 were unemployed black men from the Hill District. The newly assembled team of paramedics, known as the Freedom House ambulance drivers, were actually called into action before their ambulances were even ready for service. When the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in the spring of 1968, riots erupted all across the city of Pittsburgh, with the Hill District seeing some of the most crowded and dangerous. With the newly acquired benefit of a medical team that could be dispatched directly to the Hill District, the city of Pittsburgh enlisted the help of the Freedom House crew, who quickly proved their value to the community by saving many lives in the midst of the unrest. And as soon as they began their official operations in Pittsburgh, the Freedom House paramedics made a noticeable, life-saving difference in the communities that they served. Not only was there a team designed specifically to get people to a hospital quickly, there was a team just dedicated to public health. Everything from drug overdoses to car accidents and even minor scrapes and bruises were able to be handled by the Freedom House instead of the police. Not only were the paramedics rigorously trained to assist in all sorts of casualty events, but they actually lived in and understood the communities that they were serving. They had no arrest powers, no interest in upholding or protecting certain laws or statutes. They had no ulterior motives other than to serve. Folks who called the Freedom House paramedics often reported that the men on the team were unbelievably kind. If they didn't know a community member on a first-name basis, they would always call them sir or ma'am. Paramedics would ask permission before entering people's homes and before messing up or rearranging any of their personal belongings. The Freedom House service immediately became exceedingly popular, especially with black neighborhoods like the Hill District, where proper community stewards who aren't the police were so desperately needed. These previously underserved neighborhoods saw the sharpest decrease in death by preventable accident or injury, as well as the quickest response times from a Freedom House ambulance. This was a fantastic thing for many Americans who were absolutely marginalized and not welcome to the same standard of healthcare as the rest of the country. But it wasn't long before some of Pittsburgh's more affluent Caucasian neighborhoods started to get upset that they, for once, were getting the short end of the stick. With a prioritization of black neighborhoods, white ones often saw a slower response time and spottier service. The Freedom House paramedics, however, were actually very eager to expand into these more affluent areas, hoping that maybe they'd be able to collect fees from the wealthier residents to help subsidize the whole service. These ambitious plans, however, did not come to pass as Pittsburgh elected Peter Flaherty, the new mayor, in the 1970 election. Politically, Flaherty was a very complicated man. Early in his term, he had saved the city a bunch of money and increased our asphalt output by a factor of 10 by socializing our asphalt production. But don't let that fool you into thinking he was some kind of progressive left-winger. Flaherty very publicly opposed the desegregation of buses, which lost him an enormous amount of favor with the minority community. So you can't really paint this guy with one brush. In a lot of ways, Flaherty was just kind of an old-fashioned, pretty racist guy who was just looking to save the city money by cutting services where he could. But already failing to secure the trust of minorities in Pittsburgh, Flaherty made another move early in his term, which only furthered to bruise his reputation. Despite the life-saving work done by the Freedom House ambulance crew, Mayor Flaherty announced that ambulance sirens were to be banned downtown, citing noise pollution as his major concern. This, of course, not only sent shockwaves through the community, but literally throttled the amount of lives that the ambulances were able to save. Flaherty's annoyances with the Freedom House, however, didn't stop there. Just as the mayor had earlier become frustrated with the fact that the city didn't own their own asphalt plants, he was quickly becoming frustrated with the fact that the city didn't own their own ambulances, but rather contracted that work out to the Freedom House, even though the third party that they had contracted the work out to had literally just invented them. When the Freedom House approached Flaherty about the possibility of expanding their service to be citywide, Flaherty declined. As soon as the city's contract with the Freedom House expired, almost all of the team members were fired and replaced with an all-white team of citywide paramedics. Almost immediately, the story and contributions of the Freedom House ambulance drivers were whitewashed from history. But even so, these men who newspapers had deemed utterly unemployable just years earlier had not only set the local standard for paramedicine, but the national and international standards of what ambulances and paramedics can and should be. These men, along with the doctors and researchers like Dr. Safar, single-handedly revolutionized both our understanding of medicine and what kinds of services governments should provide to their citizens. By thinking of how to help their community, the men and women involved in the Freedom House Project were able to tackle so many problems at once: unemployment, drug overdoses, car accidents, police misconduct, inadequate medical service, and so much more. Oftentimes, we find ourselves all too complacent with the status quo and convince ourselves there's not a lot that we can do to change anything. But even though these guys didn't get the recognition that they deserved, that didn't stop a very small number of people from revolutionizing how we look at medicine and local government. And these were normal people. In fact, some of the poorest people in America that were most susceptible to disease and injury. These were people that were already discriminated against just because of their coloring. People that had had the deck stacked against them in countless ways, whether they were incarcerated, uneducated, what have you. People that rose from the ashes to become heroes and trailblazers. So the next time you see something in your neighborhood or your life or the world that you want to improve, remember that there's probably other people out there that want to do it with you. And it really doesn't take that many people to absolutely change the world.